doing fine. And a few more colleagues are about to join. And we're also waiting for Professor Shibashish. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here today. And I would like to welcome you at the Faculty Development Program hosted by the Jindal School of International Affairs. Jindal Global University is a private university based in India. We are near Delhi. And even though we are a public university, we are committed to world-class research and education. And I would like to give a few introductory remarks before we begin. And as you know, the topic of today is ChatGPT. And before I introduce our very special panelists and our very special guests, I would like to outline a few things that I would like us to keep in mind as we move on with the session today. First of all, it seems that ChatGPT as an AI tool is about to stay. And of course, it triggers a lot of questions for us, both as researchers and educators. It also triggers many ethical questions on which practices we should adopt and whether we should ban ChatGPT for students, for example, or whether we should try to accommodate ChatGPT in our educational practices, or maybe we should find other solutions. So hopefully we will explore these questions today together. And as I was preparing this panel together with Professor Sriratha, I also realized that, and the colleagues may correct me, that our university at the moment does not have a clear policy on ChatGPT. At the same time, we continue to rely on broader rules which guide anti-plagiarism policy. And personally, as an educator, as a teacher, I'm really curious to know the opinions of our special panelists, and hopefully we will have a wide range of opinions. So on this note, let me briefly introduce our speakers. And I would like also to remind everybody the basic protocol of a webinar. We're going to have 3 sessions, and I would like to kindly ask the panelists to speak for about 30 minutes. If you feel you need more time, that is not an issue. And following all the presentations, we will have a Q&A session, and then we will have a conclusion. Now, also, I would like to acknowledge that we are right now in different time zones. So very special thanks for Dr. Felix Mans, who joined us from California. I know it's very late, it's around 11 p.m. And very special thanks to Dr. Paul Breen, who joined early morning from London. And thank you, we appreciate for being flexible. Now, let me turn to our speakers. Today we have a panel of 3 educators, 3 researchers, and 3 specialists who use or who try to incorporate ChatGPT in their practices. So we have Dr. Felix Mans from California State University, San Marcos, and Dr. Mans has been affiliated earlier with other universities like Queen Mary and SOAS in London, as well as Free University of Brighton. What I found very interesting about Dr. Mans's work is that he takes quite a critical approach to education, to pedagogy, and to ChatGPT, and hopefully this will spur a very provocative discussion. We also have today Dr. Paul Breen, who specializes in education. And Dr. Breen also holds a PhD in educational technology and English language learning. He's originally from Ireland, although he has worked in different countries and he has diverse background. Dr. Breen has published extensively on education, and one of his books is Developing Educators for the Digital Age. And finally, we also have Dr. Shivashish Chatterjee, who is a professor of international relations at Jadavpur University in Kolkata. I have had the pleasure of reading Dr. Chatterjee's work on critical IR, and he has also published intensively on nuclear non-proliferation, India's spatial imagination, and conflict studies. Okay. So on this note, without further ado, let me pass the word to our first presenter, Dr. Felix Mans, who will outline what I believe is a critical approach towards ChatGPT and education. And please, Felix, let us know if you need me to help you with setting up the slides, if you have any PowerPoint.
Yeah, I have some PowerPoints. I'm clicking on sharing screen, but it says host disable participant screen sharing.
Let me try to enable this, just a moment.
Sir, you can try.
Good afternoon, Professor Shivashish Chatterjee. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, I mean, I don't exactly know where you are, so it could be either good morning or good evening. So I had some problem joining in. Sorry about that. Okay, I mean, but it's all sorted. Thanks.
The mistake was on my side. There was a mix-up with the dates. So thank you for your patience. And we can see your screen, Felix, at the moment. So I think you can go ahead.
Okay. Okay, wonderful. Well, yeah, hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming and for being here. And also thank you, of course, to Alexander for inviting me. It is pretty late here, but I am very happy to be here to yeah, share my thoughts and to have a discussion on AI, on ChatGPT in higher education. Yeah, my name is Felix Mans. I work and teach here at California State University San Marcos, which is located on the traditional and unceded territories of the Payam-Kawinchum and the Senyu people. This territory is now more commonly known by its settler and by its colonial name, which is San Diego County or Southern California. So what I want to do today basically is to offer, as Alexander pointed out, a critical perspective on AI, ChatGPT in higher education, but also on the types of discussions that have been taking place about AI and ChatGPT within higher education. I do want to give I should give a disclaimer at the beginning. I'm not a machine learning or artificial intelligence researcher. So I'm very much engaging with AI based on my own experience here at CSUSM and the kind of conversations I've been having here, but also with teachers, researchers, academics in other spaces, both the global north and the global south. And I also draw a little bit on the bit of research that I have been doing just over the course of the semester as ChatGPT has been rising to fame, I would say. So rather than kind of providing one coherent analysis, then I'm going to try to take a stab at or try to find different entry points into AI from different vantage points that hopefully will provoke some critical reflections and raise some questions about, and also perhaps some arguments against AI and ChatGPT. So I was thinking about dividing, I divided the presentation into three different parts. I'll start briefly by just looking at the type of responses to ChatGPT that I've been seeing. Then I want to look a bit more closely at one of these responses, which is kind of centered on this idea or concern with trying to catch cheaters, right? This concern with assessment, writing essays, certainly an issue that has been coming up here and what that means in the context of ChatGPT. And then in the last section, I want to reflect a bit on some of the issues that have been pointed out by critical researchers on AI and what the implications of that are, particularly for higher education. Okay, just to give a little bit of context here at CSUSM, and I think also in other institutions across the globe, ChatGPT has been over the semester certainly been rising to fame quite quickly. So we've seen a whole host of different special meetings, discussions, different kind of events, such as this one being set up, committees being formed that are trying to think about what to do with ChatGPT in academia. How is it going to impact academia? How should we incorporate it? Should we incorporate it in the first place? Should we resist it? How can we resist it, etc.? So from what I've seen, there have been really a whole host of different responses from academics to AI. One kind of broad set of reactions is definitely like one of excitement, right? And within that, we have also, again, a different range of manifestation of that excitement. On the probably most extreme end, what I've seen is definitely almost a form of techno-fascism, fetishism, where AI is kind of seen as a solution almost to all of the ailments that kind of afflict the university, without really, going into much critical reflection on the rise of these technologies. We've also seen a lot of excitement, or I've seen a lot of excitement with regards to how AI can be included into teaching, how it can be incorporated into classrooms. Again, often not with too much critical reflections. And then on a bit more tempered side, there's definitely also quite a lot of, I think, curiosity with regards to what potentials AI could hold for the university, what it can do within classrooms. On the other side of this, we've seen, I've seen a lot of people who are quite worried about AI and ChatGPT, right? So there's definitely, I think, a lot of skepticism for sure towards ChatGPT, towards AI. And I think this group of responses has definitely raised a few quite serious and quite good questions about, for example, the reproduction of dominant systems of power, different forms of classism, racism, sexism, and about the changing nature of work within academia, whether it's changing for the worse, and also about just student learning, the ability to teach students basic skills, reading, writing, all of this type of stuff. There's also a kind of response that kind of sees this these kind of processes as almost inevitable, and inevitable not necessarily in a good way, but in a quite negative, pessimistic way, almost like a capitulation to the presence and the rise of AI and ChatGPT. Almost this idea that, we can't really do anything about this, even if we would want to resist it. AI is here to stay. We can't get rid of it. So the only really option for us is to adapt in different ways, which I think, suffers a bit sometimes from buying into this hype around AI, the hype that critical scholars have been critiquing quite significantly as kind of, I hope I go into that a little bit later. And then more profoundly, I think there's also been a lot of anxiety and almost an existential threat about what this could mean for the profession, right, for teaching. And I think here's definitely this anxiety about this assessment, right? What happens to the cheaters, right? When people start writing essays through ChatGPT now, right? How can we, have assessment, certainly in social sciences at that point? But also even more profoundly, again, worries about being replaced by AI, AI and taking over jobs, which again, I think, there's definitely a question again about, buying into a certain hype that's not necessarily questioned. Okay. So what I find really interesting, however, is that despite these different range of responses, these really intense debates among academics, among teachers, among faculty, I feel like that really contrasts what students are thinking about ChatGPT, or the extent to which students are engaging with ChatGPT, at least from my experience here. So certainly at the beginning of the semester, it really seemed like students weren't very much aware of ChatGPT. So yeah, there's this interesting anecdote by one of my colleagues who kind of preemptively wanted to kind of discuss the potential harms of ChatGPT with regards to assessment and cheating in their class. And she kind of started sharing that at the beginning of the semester. And it kind of became clear to her that the students had no clue what she was talking about. So she was kind of jokingly remarking that, oh, she just kind of told the students how to use ChatGPT for cheating, right? Which certainly is definitely quite similar to the experience that I had as well so far, that throughout the whole semester, there was really only one student who asked me about ChatGPT, and that was particularly about using it to gather sources to write an essay. But I haven't really heard anything from students in hallways anywhere else discussing or bringing this up, which is quite a contrast to what I have been talking with students about, which is a whole different set of issues that, coming from the UK here, was quite shocking. So yeah, what students come to me, the type of issues they come to me with are much more profound, about things like stress, depression that they're feeling, anxiety, different forms of overwork. So most of my students are working full-time while they're also enrolled full-time, mounting levels of debt, and tuition fees, and also care commitments that they have, all of which kind of prevent them from really engaging or getting the most out of their education. Again, I think this really contrasts, this kind of type or big discussions about ChatGPT that certainly exists over faculty, that I think in many cases takes away almost from these other types of discussions that we see. I think it's also worth mentioning that most of my students, or a large constituency here, the student body is made up of working class Hispanic and first generation people, which also is reflected within political science. So I pulled up some statistics here from my department from 2021, and you can see in the first stat here, most of the students are California residents, so they come from local areas. And then in the graph here at the bottom, you can see that more than half of the students are Hispanic or Latino. Okay, so I want to engage particularly with this one set of responses that I thought was really prevalent here, okay? And this is this idea of, how can we catch the cheaters, right? How can we prevent people from using, especially ChatGPT, to write essays, right? Which is certainly something that I initially was also concerned about, worried about, or I was thinking about. So the class, I teach a global governance class, and I have a midterm and a final essay. And yeah, this would certainly be avenues where ChatGPT could be used to write an essay. But then I was also thinking, also as people were coming with me with all these other sets of issues, I was starting to think about, okay, why would students use ChatGPT to write essays in the first place, right? And certainly coming from kind of critical pedagogies, employing anarchist, feminist, and decolonial pedagogies, which teach us that, we must take students' experiences, concerns, and perspectives seriously. This seemed like a very profound or very important question to ask in this context, right? Why would students use ChatGPT to write essays for them? And I think there's certainly a whole set of different responses and different reasons. And I just want to engage with two here that I thought are quite important. One of them would be, for instance, a lack of interest, right? So a lot of students increasingly are now taking classes, or have to take a class because it's a requirement, right? They might not actually be interested in the content of that class, which also often is the case for the degree that they're taking, right? So the class or the degree often for students is a career builder, right? Where the content is often secondary or even of no interest in the most extreme cases. Which also I think interlinks with this, this broader issue that students seem to increasingly see the university as a means for social mobility exclusively, rather than using it as or seeing it as a space for other things such as intellectual growth, intellectual pleasure, or then more radically, to learn about the world and to try to change it. Right? Which also then I think connects with this also broader trend. I think that students almost often see themselves as close to fully neoliberal subjects, right? They see themselves often as increasingly as consumers that are basically paying for a product, the product being the degree, and where the teachers then become almost like a customer service role, right? Which reflects this kind of well-documented deeper issue of the erosion of the public university model in general, right? By realigning it with corporate and neoliberal agendas, right? Which also includes, trying to run universities or transform universities almost into private enterprises, or to run them almost like businesses through different forms of managerialism, careerism, individualism, competition, etc., which is an issue that is really well laid out by Peter Fleming, who wrote this book that I put on the slides here, Dark Academia, How Universities Die, and I really highly recommend this book. An argument that is made here, or when we look at this broader trend now, what I think really comes out is that we're facing a structural issue here, right? When we see this lack of interest, where universities are, of course, entangled and embedded with, we need to recognize this, within broader, both local, national, regional, and also global structures of power that make up our modern international order, which includes different things such as coloniality, neoliberalism, right? Rising fascism now, the state, racism, sexism, etc. And certainly students' attitudes and relationships to the university are entangled, right? They're not disconnected from the structural reality. And they're definitely shaped by these deeper structures, both in terms of reproducing them, but also, of course, in terms of resisting them in many cases as well, which need to be said. But again, when faced with such an analysis or such a realization, the question really is the policing or surveilling of students for using ChatGPT really the right solution? Right? Because these are structural issues, right? Structural issues that need structural solutions. Again, is policing or surveilling here, is that really the right question to ask? A second reason that I think also connects to this broader kind of context of higher education is just looking at and taking seriously students' realities, right? So students across Western university spaces, such as the US and the UK, face things like rising university and tuition fees, student loans, and also rising costs of living, right? So for example, between 1990 and 2010, the funding for full-time students in US public university dropped by 26%. And within that same time frame, tuition fees rose by 113%. Also, connected to that, student debt was expected to reach $2 trillion in 2022, which is larger than credit card debt and auto loans. And of course, these are particularly problems for working class people, right? Who need to take on this type of debt, the type of people who are, for example, at CSUSM, right? Part of these realities are then also, students being, having to work alongside classes, having to over-enroll in classes and attempt to save money and finish faster, care responsibilities, anxiety, stress, depression, etc., which certainly students have talked to me about. And then also students or the prospects for students, I think, look quite dire, right? There's often a lack of decently paid jobs. University degrees are often now a basic requirement for many jobs. But also in a much more profound level, just the kind of prospects for, an inhabitable planet, it's free from fascism, misogyny, police violence, look increasingly dire. And I don't necessarily think that the university is really helping here, becoming more and more performance focused, more and more assessment heavy, support deprived. And as a result of that, much less conducive to learning, to fostering creativity, critical thinking, things like intellectual curiosity, and become much more space to induce stress, frustration, depression, etc. Which is why Peter Fleming, who I mentioned earlier, identifies the university increasingly as an anxiety machine, both for teachers and for students. So, for example, something really interesting to consider here is also a global study that he refers to, which included 14,000 students across 19 universities. And 35% of those students experienced at least one of 6 mental health disorders that they tested for. And again, reasons for that included what I just mentioned: pressures to excel, so, performance, financial worries, workloads, etc. Also, suicide attempts among US undergrads has increased quite dramatically from 0.7% in 2013 to 1.8% in 2018. And also student depression over that same time period increased dramatically from 9.4% to 21.1%. So again, I think here, the question really is, I think that our energies and efforts should be focused on addressing these structural changes, not policing students for using ChatGPT, right? So asking these structural questions. But in line with that, also, I think that this then also means, not just accepting AI or ChatGPT as kind of simple techno fixes to some of these larger problems. So certainly scholars who study global politics from critical perspective have long pointed out that the global crises that we're facing, including the crises that the university is facing, are fundamentally political, economic, and social in nature, right? And therefore require also political, economic, and social solutions, right? And techno fixes that kind of portray these issues as technological in nature, or as being able then to address or require a technical solution, I think can miss this point significantly and constitute almost what James Ferguson would call an anti-politics machine. And there's certainly different ways to change the university. I think I'll skip these slides now, just in the interest of time, but I'm happy to pick that back up later. But what I do also want to mention and talk about is, the different kind of issues that critical scholars within kind of machine learning, AI, the types of issues that they've been pointing out with regards to artificial intelligence, and again, how that applies to higher education and teaching in higher education. So fundamentally, AI is a set of computational operations, right, that include different types of areas. One of the largest ones being machine learning, which includes large language models, LLMs, of which ChatGPT is an example, right? Now, these critical scholars have been pointing out that AI itself can't be separated from this broader social context in general, right? So AI emerges very much in relations to existing institutions, ideologies, and structures. So Dan McQuillan, for example, then identifies AI as layered and interdependent arrangement of technology, institutions, and ideology, right? Which also means that AI is never neutral, right? It acts in the world in ways that can affect the distribution of power and set up and maintain different forms of boundaries and separation. So because of that, Dan McQuillan also prompts us to think of or realize ChatGPT as what he calls a bullshit generator in many ways. So ChatGPT is primarily based on probability. So it's really good at filling in blanks, right? So as Dan McQuillan provides this example of, it's really good at, when it's prompted with something like the cat sits on the blank, it's really good at trying to figure out what's the most probable word that would come here, right? So it's based on mathematical optimization, right? Not necessarily reason. So that also means that ChatGPT is not intelligent, right? It doesn't know what it's talking about. It doesn't understand what it is producing, right? Yeah, and McWillan sums this up quite eloquently, I think, by saying that, you know, ChatGPT produces baseless assertions, which with unfailing confidence, because that's what it's designed to do. Which also then brings up this question of meaning, right? And I think forces us to realize that ChatGPT doesn't actually produce any meaning, right? Again, it's good at being probable, but all the meaning that, you know, when we see a text or when we see an image that's produced by ChatGPT, there is no meaning. All the meaning is inscribed by those who are reading that text, who are viewing that text, right? So it's really an illusion. It's a good party trick, right? But ChatGPT in itself doesn't have any communicative intent. It has no idea of, you know, the reader's state of mind, for example. So it's really our human communicative competencies and predispositions to understand or to try to interpret communicative acts as having meaning that really ChatGPT uses and make ChatGPT appear to be intelligent, appear to have meaning, right? And yeah, it's been documented that this can have different forms of potential harm, and that this harm obviously then also increases the more developed these language models become, because then also the illusions that they produce become much harder to spot, which has led to different forms of algorithmic violence that I'll try to talk about in a second. But also, I think this makes ChatGPT to a large extent unfit as a teaching tool. Certainly, if we're thinking about, what types of things we would assign our students, have some students read, right? I think it's much more useful to assign things that are actually written by humans that have communicative intent, where there is meaning in those texts. Another kind of key issue or area that, critical scholars have been looking at and pointing out is the type of data sets that go into training large language models such as ChatGPT. So basically, large language models need to be fed by large amounts of data sets that are scraped from the internet, right? And there's often this misconception that because these are large in size, that they're also then representative and diverse data that they get fed, right? But in reality, data sets are very much skewed towards existing relations, existing structures of power, including things like racism, sexism, classism. And yeah, there are different avenues in which that is the case. So firstly, for instance, we can look at internet access, right? So who's able to access the internet? And what we see is that it's usually younger generations and people in developed countries that have more access to the internet that produce more of the data that is then fed as data sets to train these large language models. And we also see biases within the specific subsets of data that are then used to train these models. So for example, Reddit has been used to train different language models. And within the US, 67% of Reddit users are male and 64% are between 19 and 29 years old. And then there's also this question of, who can safely navigate specific sites that are used to train language models. Who is perhaps driven off of particular platforms such as Twitter because they're being harassed, and certainly that's the case for different marginalized communities. So another way in which kind of bias is instilled here within those data sets. There have also been problems with regards to filtering out bad data. So there have been attempts, obviously, to exclude things like racial slurs and pornographic content, primarily by trying to look for keywords and then eliminating those articles, that data from what gets fed. But that has also meant filtering out, for example, articles and content that actually talks positively about some of these issues, such as talking positively about sexual autonomy, gender identity, LGBTQ plus issues, etc. Right? That then doesn't feature. Now, fourth, some of these scholars have been pointing out that language models can become locked into regressive values. So social movements, such as Black Lives Matter, right, constantly change values, right? Change our understanding of the world, change our understanding of old events. But often social movements, especially radical and critical social movements, those are critical of existing systems of power, often don't receive either attention at all or don't receive positive attention, accurate attention, right? So then the type of data that is produced on them is usually skewed against them and skewed towards power, right? And then large language models can distort social movements, right, and align with power. And again, it's quite difficult to constantly update training data, which is often too costly even for larger corporations. Then we have the issue also of missing particular toxic data. So some of the auditing models that are used to erase bias often are based on a priori kind of categories that often make sense, for example, in a US context, but that can miss other forms of discrimination that apply elsewhere. And also there are issues of more subtler forms in which ideology is communicated and reproduced. So for example, we have things about AI is referring particularly to woman doctor rather than just doctors, reproducing this idea that, doctors are fundamentally male. Right? So in all these different ways, we see that there's definitely an overrepresentation of hegemonic worldviews, right, of existing systems of power that become reproduced. And there's an overrepresentation also of misogynist and racist ideology in some of the training data that gets fed into AIs, which again, I think make it quite unfit to have that and be used as teaching tools for students in our classrooms. So another set of critiques or issues has been this question about whether ChatGPT is actually a global good, which is something that OpenAI has been claiming, and OpenAI being the company behind ChatGPT. But I think when we look into that, we can definitely question that assertion. So for example, when we look at languages, for instance, ChatGPT-4, which is now the new model, can't answer, for instance, on what continent Ethiopia is when it's asked in Amharic, right? GPT-3, which came before ChatGPT, only contained about 7% of non-English language data. And 90% of languages, which are spoken by more than 1 billion people, are not featuring at all. Right? So there's definitely a Eurocentrism here. Also, it's been, there have been a whole host of issues where many AI models, for example, identify Black people disproportionately or label them as things like monkeys, apes, thieves, and criminals. Also, language models often benefit those with higher socioeconomic status more, come from a particular class background, right? It's those who can actually afford to buy things like Google Home, Amazon Alexa, Apple devices that have Siris, while also speaking the same languages that they're trained in, right? So it's clear that, these types of large language models are made for some people more than for others. Which brings me to the last thing I want to cover, which is the political economy of AI. And one of the key topics here has been the question of data theft, right? So obviously the scraping of the internet for data, despite all these issues with curating it and eliminating the bad data, obviously relies on the free access to data, right? It's not paid for in any way, and none of the users of the internet are asked for consent for this data to be used in this way. Also, AI requires a huge amount of labor, actual labor, for example, in data centers, right? It requires people to supply and to label data sets, which often get turned into forms of ghost labor that become hidden or invisibilized behind all this AI hype that's very much about, claims that AI are self-training and so efficient, etc. But again, when we look at the political economy of AI, we definitely see exploitation and intensification of existing relations of labor and power. So one quite well covered recent example is the case of the company Sama in Kenya, and its use of Kenyan workers. So basically, starting in November of 2021, OpenAI commissioned a company to have that featured Kenyan workers to clean up data sets, right? This company is Sama, which is based here in San Francisco, and that employs workers in Kenya, in Uganda, and in India to label data for different Silicon Valley companies, not just OpenAI, but also Google, Microsoft. And it claims very much to be this ethical AI company that uplifts people from poverty, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, the idea of OpenAI commissioning Sama was that, you would have people that would label bad data and feed it to an AI that then it would be able to detect different forms of violence and harm. So one of the first issues was that those workers were paid very little, only between 1.32 and $2 per hour. And also basically what they had to do was then to go through large amounts of extremely obscene forms of data material, both textual, visual, etc., that feature things like torture, murder, child abuse, suicide, bestiality, incest, right? And they had to label this and then to be removed, right, for removal. And this predictably has caused different forms of trauma, different forms of mental health issues for which there was no support from the company. And it's quite unclear to what extent OpenAI works with other such data labeling firms, basically because there's no real disclosure of this type of information. So again, I think if you look at the political economy of AI, it becomes really difficult to justify using that in any capacity, right? Let alone in teaching, in a teaching capacity at a university, right? If you're serious about some of these issues. And then connectedly, and I'm almost done, I promise. This connects with the political ecology of AI as well, which is another really big ethical question, I think. So to run and to cool all of these data servers requires usually a tremendous amount of energy and produces a huge kind of environmental footprint, right? In addition to that, training basic language models requires an equivalent of about 284 tons of CO2. So by comparison, an average human produces an equivalent of about 5 tons of CO2 per year. And most of the energy that is used to train language models doesn't come from the renewables as well. And also, even if it does come from renewables, obviously renewables themselves have a pretty big environmental footprint, at least currently. And then also the trade-offs, I think, for increased energy use are often questionable. So even to produce or to get just small increases in the accuracy levels of language models requires often very large amounts of emissions and very large amounts of money. And again, it is, oppressed, exploited people in the global south that are going to be most affected from the expanding use of energy and the expanding environmental footprint of AI, of things like ChatGPT. The same people who are also the least likely to benefit from AI. And this is the last slide, which is a quote that a group of critical researchers led by Bender posed, right, which I think we need to consider. And they asked, basically, is it fair or just to ask, for example, that the residents of the Maldives, likely to be underwater in 21, or the 800,000 people in Sudan affected by drastic floods, pay the environmental price of training and deploying ever larger English language models, when similar large-scale models aren't being produced for Diwehi or Sudanese Arabic? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Felix. I found this very interesting and very critical, which is exactly how I expected this to be. Now, we do have our Q&A at the end, but considering that it's about midnight in California, I don't want Dr. Felix to be obliged to stay all alone. Let me pause here and ask my colleagues and maybe panelists as well, if you have any critique or feedback or any questions.
I'm glad it did make sense that I didn't disappoint in terms of what you expected. That's good to hear.
No big expectations, but I felt it would be critical. And I think we have to be critical and maintain a critical perspective. So I would treat this presentation as a gentle warning, perhaps, And in fact, I totally agree that ChatGPT may reproduce existing biases, online biases, and power structure. So we do have one question from my colleague, Professor Devyani Gupta. Let me read this aloud. Fabulous presentation. My concern is about students relying on AI and ChatGPT. Wouldn't it be correct to say that AI and ChatGPT are encouraging attitudes towards education, which don't actually dismantle the structural and institutional weaknesses that Dr. Matz has very correctly highlighted? I think this was exactly the essence of the presentation. Education has become a transactional, corporatized space, and students want returns on their investment in terms of good placements, jobs, right, and not necessarily in the form of learning and education. ChatGPT paves the way for producing homogenized, uncritical reading and writing. Can we actually talk about addressing structural weaknesses and lack of support for students while overlooking the role played by instrumentalized education in this story? Also, for us as a faculty, is the only way out for us to recalibrate our pedagogy and syllabi? Very important question. Do we need to change our syllabi, our courses, to make it more result-oriented and quantifiable in terms of assessing value addition to a student's life, in terms of landed internships, marks, quick degrees, and jobs? I don't know if you have anything to comment on this, Felix. I think this is exactly what your presentation was about, and I'm glad it resonated with Devyani, and I tend to share this skepticism and this critique of instrumental rationality, so to speak.
Yeah, no, that's definitely, thanks very much for that comment, Devyani. Yeah, I think I definitely share a lot of the concerns in there. Yeah, I'm always, and yeah, it's probably similar to you. It's really frustrating to see sometimes, and to be fair, it's not all students, right? There are definitely a lot of students that don't see it this way, but there's definitely a growing amount, I think it feels, students that see this as a transactional space. And I'm really reluctant to blame students for this sometimes, because again, you know, students already come there with experience. They're not empty vessels, as Ferre would tell us, right? They already, you know, they already come with ideologies. They were already trained in this way. So sometimes I think difficult to blame students. But yeah, I mean, your comment there at the end, I mean, I think I'm still optimistic that, you know, structural change is possible to a large extent. I think they're quite substantive, quite promising, quite deeply critical movements within university spaces that are taking place, not only by faculty, but often led by students themselves. So in the UK and in the US, obviously, we have the whole decolonizing university movement, decolonizing the syllabus movement, that go very much address these structural issues as well, right? Most of them being inspired, of course, by movements in the global South, such as Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall, that exactly address these type of issues. So again, there's still dissents, resistance, I think, by students. And then, you know, there are a whole host of different alternative modules, models that we can look at in terms of how to organize universities. So there's an anti-university movement in the UK, for instance, that I've been part of, for instance, that sets up completely different educational structures that attract students as well, a whole host of different students. And again, you know, if we think about universities like Unitierra in Oaxaca, Universidad de la Tierra, that arises particularly out of addressing social needs of indigenous peoples in the area that are geared against neoliberalism. The Zapatista pedagogies, for example. I think there are a whole host of different examples that we can look at also for hope and for alternatives that, for me, I draw my hope from. And I use kind of as a basis for inspiration that it can be different, right? This stuff is not inevitable. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Anybody else colleagues perhaps has some final question or burning comment regarding Dr. Mans's presentation.
So I was just going to say, I'm up next, Felix, but I really like that. And I think you were mentioning about initiatives in the UK. And one of the things that I felt from listening to that is I think we're almost operating here in the UK from a terrain where capitalism has become so embedded that it almost reflects the political structures in the world. And the kind of prevailing view, for example, in the UK or in the United States, that a particular form of neoliberalism has become so embedded in society that you can't have radical change. All you can do is almost work within the parameters of that.
Yeah, I think that's the eternal question, right? About, how to respond to this. I think to a large extent, I think it needs to happen within universities as well, or within existing structures. I think that's one movement, one part of it. For me, I don't know, maybe it's naive, but I do see a lot of people being drawn to things that try to operate outside. Of course, the question of outside is always difficult because exactly what you say, it's so pervasive, right? It's everywhere. But yeah, again, then looking at really radical movements, usually outside of the global north, it's can be done. It is possible. Universidad de la Tierra, Zapatistas are for me a big inspiration, I think. But yeah, to get to that point is obviously a whole different question. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say as well on this topic for sure.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Well, since we have already passed the word to Dr. Breen, why don't we continue with Dr. Breen's presentation? And once again, thank you very much, Felix. Please feel free to stay on, but if you feel it's too late, of course, you're not obliged to stay here. All right, so let me pass the turn to Dr. Paul Breen. And let me remind you that Dr. Paul Breen is a senior lecturer and digital learning developer with University College of London Academic Communications Center. And Paul, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so as I say, I am coming at this from a slightly different perspective, in that because of the particular environment that we find ourselves in the UK, I think now the way that this has become such I wouldn't say such a part of everything, but it has certainly dominated the discussions that we're having. I almost feel quite uncritical here because I'm looking at it from the perspective of how can ChatGPT revitalize our pedagogy, and how can we integrate it in a way that is socially just for our students. So again, I've already been introduced, but I work for UCL. I'm a senior lecturer in English for academic purposes and a digital learning developer. My PhD research has been in the areas of educational technology and English language teaching. And I published a book, or I got a book published in 2018 entitled Developing Educators for the Digital Age. And it was about the ways in which teachers integrate technology and pedagogy in their practice. And that drew on a TPAC perspective from Mishra and Kohler. And also it looked at things from Etienne Wenger's community of practice theory. So the core argument of that is that, or the core argument of that was, at the end of the day, I think pedagogy will normally trump technology. And it's the human element that's most important. And it's about probably not allowing ourselves to be overtaken by, I suppose, what Felix has very aptly described as the fetishization of technology, and to see these as tools that we incorporate into our existing knowledge base. So in the particular field that I'm in, English language teaching and education, technology, I think, has always had quite a complex relationship with pedagogy. But at the same time, English language teaching has been ahead of the field in many ways as well, because it is, since the days of computer-assisted language learning, for example, the English language teaching world has always tried to integrate technology in a way that isn't just about doing it for technology's sake, but is actually much more about doing things in a way that, for example, in the work of Mark Warshauer, the idea of bridging the gap between the developed and the developing worlds. How effective that was, I don't know, but it was quite a powerful movement at one point in the English language world. So a good quote, or in an academic article that I saw from a few years ago, was one from a guy that I used to work with. And it was using the idea of Bob Dylan's "Times They Are Changing." We've got to adapt in some way, or we're going to struggle. And I think that has always been the attitude of higher education, and particularly now in the UK, that seems to be the prevailing mood around ChatGPT and intelligent AI. But at the same time, I often use this image in my teaching with students when I'm talking to them about things such as Wikipedia, for example. There are good and bad sides to this, and you have to be aware of both. So I use that image of David Banner, as he was in the UK, and I think Bruce Banner in the United States in The Incredible Hulk. So again, in terms of the theoretical background to a lot of this, where I'm coming from in light of my PhD research and publication and whole theoretical perspective, is that technology, pedagogy, content, all these things work in synergy with each other. And I also feel quite strongly that the work of people like Gary Motteram, who was my PhD supervisor, speaks a lot of sense on this matter. In that, for example, in 2009, Gary Motteram and Pete Sharma, they talked about how we shouldn't see technologies as being, something so completely revolutionary that they're going to completely rewrite the script. And they used the example of things like hieroglyphics and how writing evolved, and then how eventually that came to be produced through the printing presses that emerged in the Industrial Revolution. So even though these things are an adaptation or an evolution, they still rely on a lot of the same principles that informed writing and communication throughout time. So I think by taking that perspective, you do reduce the tendency to fetishize every new technology that comes along. And you also reduce that tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And you start to see these things as another step that can be integrated into the main purpose of what education or what communication is. And I think that's what I was saying earlier. One of the differences that I got from Felix's depiction of the United States and the UK at the minute is that there really is this sense in our environment at the moment that things are absolutely changing in a completely radical way, almost along the lines of people like Mark Prensky and Doug Tapscott, who coined that idea of digital natives and digital immigrants, for example. So Prensky came up with that idea, and it was this idea that young people are so radically different from older people that their brains are rewired differently. And I think that was just assuming that you know, we needed to completely adapt our way of teaching and gamify everything, and probably gimmickify everything, if I can use a verb that doesn't actually exist. But it was this whole idea that, oh, we're entering this radical period of change where nothing is ever going to be the same again. But I would argue that it will be. So one of the things as well that educators often fear, teachers often fear, is this sense of fashion and fads. And in a book on research methods, Alvesen and Sandberg talk about how something might be a hot topic today and then it's in danger of going cold tomorrow. And that was one of the things I found in my research. A lot of the teachers were afraid of embracing new technologies that would be really cool and popular and trendy this week. And then next week, after they've invested all that time, they will be out of fashion. And again, I think one of the things about ChatGPT is it keeps evolving, and there will be new forms of this that will come along. So it's not just about ChatGPT or one particular tool. You know. But the question then is whether or not, is it a fad? Like some of the things that appear here in this picture, like the Rubik's Cube and the Pokemon. Though again, some of those are coming back into fashion now, which maybe says something about our ages. So going back to what I said about Mottram and Sharma's work, for example, and again, the TPAC theory of Mishra and Kohler, the question is, how radically different are the tools and the learning processes of yesteryear and today? Is it not the same set of outcomes? So here I have a picture of my two little nieces in Ireland, you know, looking at their iPad before going to sleep. And here, the other part of the slide, you can see my sister's class in probably the early 1980s in Ireland, learning about things by doing. But in both situations, the children are learning something. And that's, I think, what the centrality of my argument is that it is all about teaching and learning at the end of the day. And that's what we have to do with ChatGPT, in the sense of we have to incorporate this into the pedagogy in the same way as we have incorporated other tools. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to let it dominate or we have to reshape everything around this one particular tool. I don't think we have to do that. Yeah, again, just I'm thinking of there's a quote that comes to mind, and it's from one of the leading writers in the field of English for academic purposes, Liz Hamp-Lyons, and she was talking about how our teaching practice has changed because technology is now so ubiquitous in our classrooms. So like you've got like the whiteboard, the projector, all these things. And yeah, it does reshape our practice to a large extent. And I don't know, even if I don't think ChatGPT is even as radical a change as the emergence of electronic whiteboards, for example, which in themselves are just an adaptation of chalkboards. So it's the same set of outcomes. So I think the problem with these more advanced technologies, though, is that they are creating a fear of us losing control of things and being so advanced that they can almost do our work for us. You know, and a lot of the stuff out there on Netflix, for example, and articles in the in the media do feed into that. For example, the TV series Humans, where we can't tell humans apart from the robots. And then The Conversation had an article a couple of years ago talking about relationships between humans and robots. So a lot of that feeds into the idea that somehow or somewhere in the next generation, we're going to be replaced by technology. And the bigger problem, though, for us as teachers, and ChatGPT certainly feeds into this, is this challenge of knowing what's authentic. You know, and this famous meme that does the rounds a lot of Abraham Lincoln saying, "Don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it." And again, I think I've mentioned a lot of theorists in the field of educational technology, and you know, I was one of them on a lesser scale in writing my book and doing my PhD. But sometimes I think that the smartest guy around in terms of predicting where technologies were going to take us was David Bowie in 1999, when he appeared on BBC Two's Newsnight. And he talked about how the internet is going to lead us to a point where we're not going to know the difference in fact and fiction. And we certainly see that in the ways in which sites such as Facebook have influenced politics in the UK and the US, particularly in the period between 2016 and 2022. So what I did, just in terms of looking at what ChatGPT can actually do, I asked it to write me 100 words about why it's a useful tool for students in higher education. And I'm thinking back to the quote by Felix about how it's a brilliant bullshit generator, because this is a brilliant piece of bullshit, actually. So ChatGPT here claims that it's based on cultural historical activity theory, which is a theory that in its most recent incarnation has developed into something that is increasingly being used in higher education as a theoretical framework. And at first glance, when you look at this, if you weren't familiar with that, you could actually believe it. And I did check it out. There's no evidence. But my point here is that, so it's wrong, but it's a very convincing attempt, because here is the authentic cultural historical activity system framework. Now, what I thought, though, and this is a question which I can't answer, I would think the answer should probably be no. If a student had written that on an undergraduate or master's course in the Institute of Education, which is part of where I work, would everyone be able to see immediately that this isn't accurate? Or like me, would they think they'd be 99% sure that that's wrong, but there would be that 1% of doubt in their mind, and they would have to go and check it? And considering that I wrote about this theoretical framework in my PhD, that says quite a lot about what ChatGPT is actually capable of, in the sense that it just adds to this environment where we're not quite sure what's real and what's not, which I think is why higher education fears it a lot. Now, is there any way that we can harness this potential? And again, this is where I think the UK context maybe differs from the one that Felix was describing, in that there is a sense that we have to do this, that it's going to become so embedded that in some way we're going to have to integrate our work with artificial intelligence in a new way. And I think that there are ways that it can actually benefit us. And I got this idea from someone that I worked with who's now based in Dubai, where she talked about the idea of kairos versus chronos, lived experience versus mathematical time. And her argument was that kairos is the time when we lose sense of time. It's those moments like, you know, taking students out on a trip, for example, or in other walks of life. It's like those moments of falling in love, or writing a poem, or riding a bicycle, or whatever. Whereas Chronos, mathematical time, is the time that we spend on things like administration or emails or living in a 9-to-5 world. And that just got me thinking about my own teaching. And here's some examples of taking students out into real world situations. The picture on the right, for example, is in China. And I went to do a couple of weeks work in China a few years ago before COVID. And I was teaching these students, and they had such a rigid, schedule, like 45-minute schedules, 10-minute break, 45-minute schedule. And I just said, right, okay, let's abandon that whole philosophy, and we're just going to work for an hour and a half, and we're just going to forget breaks, and we're just going to take away the regimented sort of atmosphere. And they loved it. So in some ways, we could twist ChatGPT and these kinds of programs to our benefit by maybe letting them do the more mechanical, methodical work. And even yesterday, I was talking to someone who gave me an idea about research projects. I mean, imagine if we could get ChatGPT to fill in all those long, annoying forms that we sometimes have to fill in. But then again, you need the human eye to look over them to make sure that there's no mistakes. You know, and I was just thinking, I mean, I do a lot of work in designing Moodle sites, for example, at UCL. And I would actually like a world in which this admin work was done more easily, where I could prompt something like ChatGPT to make the changes or to do the updates and all those things that take a couple of hours, when actually I would rather be developing my own knowledge or working with students and so on. So one thing that people in the UK have been doing as well, not necessarily to give to students, I should point out, is designing assessments, or using ChatGPT to design assessments, which is another thing that takes up so much of our time. And I did this because I was working with some master's students in physiotherapy, and I don't create their assignments, but I just thought, okay, I'm going to ask ChatGPT to create me an assessment. So I asked it to design me an assessment task for a group of sports science students who've been doing a module in musculoskeletal sports injuries prevention and cure. And I asked it to combine both spoken and written elements at master's level, and a component that will feed into the students' professional interests and or work practice. Now, we don't have time to look at all of this, but I found this, again, kind of scarily good, because obviously it is drawn on, it doesn't know what it's producing, but it is obviously drawn on something that's already out there in the public domain. And it did create quite a convincing assessment with an objective, task description, assessment criteria, and conclusion. And even though physiotherapy is not my background, it did look quite similar to the kinds of things that the students might work on. So this was the written component. So it produced both a written component and a spoken component. And it asked the students to prepare a written report outlining the injury prevention and rehabilitation program they designed for a professional athlete. And it explained what sections should be included. Now, again, I think ChatGPT can do quite mainstream assessments like this, and this is where I'm going with this. If you want simple assessments, nice, simple, organized assessments like this, then ChatGPT is great. If you wanted to think outside the box, it can't. For example, I had a master's student recently who got asked by her tutor to write an assignment about why cure is better than prevention. And actually the student said she didn't want to do that because maybe like some people in this audience, she was a big fan of cricket, being from an Indian background, and she actually said that many sports injuries in cricket cannot be prevented, and therefore you've got to take that perspective and work around that. And I thought, well, that's, you know, that's quite a challenging thing to do, to challenge your tutors' expectations of what they want you to write, and to be able to do that convincingly. And I think this is where we're going. This is the way to defeat ChatGPT, if you like. If it's not a battle, but you know what I mean. Just to make our assessments more challenging, in the sense of demanding more criticality, and probably more socially just, because I think the whole idea of catching cheaters is absolutely endemic within higher education. And Jan MacArthur here is one of the leading thinkers in this field, and she says Turnitin is the worst thing to happen to academic writing. And she's also written about this in a 2019 article, which I've referenced. So this is where we're at. This you know, we are already slaves to Turnitin in many ways within higher education. And here you even have professional essay writing services advertising ways to beat Turnitin. So this shows the flaws of a system based around the policing of plagiarism. And that's why the whole culture needs to change away from this policing and punishment. So we need more personalized, tailored, and real-world assessments. And one good way of doing that is the use of portfolios, and not in a business sense, but in more of a personalized sense, where the students are being more reflective and relating things to their own lives and their own work, because it's much harder for ChatGPT to simulate that. And again, just by doing this, it moves them away from the whole culture where they think it's all about, you know, it's all about cheating. It changes the entire climate that students are operating in. So it doesn't even cross their minds that they should cheat, because, you know, why would they? It's about, they're studying degrees for developmental purposes. So yeah, so again, as I've said, this isn't some radical departure. It's a continuation of how technology and pedagogy has worked in sync for decades. And that picture, I haven't got too much time to explain it, but it's from a guy called Cedric Taylor, who was writing in the 1990s about how African education, for example, has been centuries old and believed in socio-constructive learning decades and centuries before it became popular in the West. So, and again, just in terms of you know, using technology to engage our students, I think, and get them doing things more related to their real lives. This is a picture of a class, an English language class in a previous place that I worked, where the students were encouraged to take their iPads out into the real world and make podcasts interviewing market traders in the local area. So again, the whole reason for showing that, and just to summarize, the teacher is still the central chess piece around which the class is based. So everything is still about pedagogy rather than technology. And ultimately, I think that's the main message that I would want to put across, that you know, even with the rise of ChatGPT and the likely next wave of even more intelligent artificial intelligence, I think humans aren't going to be replaced by robotics just yet. And that picture again is from China, where a few years ago I encountered my first, probably most advanced robot to date, where this little guy used to run around the hotel rooms speaking Chinese, giving guidance or doing chores or whatever, and when his batteries ran low, he could actually go to the wall and plug himself in. I use he because I can't think of not quite sure what to call them. So yeah, so that's the essential message, I think, for me, is that yeah, ChatGPT is quite radical, but it's no more radical a departure than previous technologies, and we have managed to integrate them into our practice. And if anything's going to change, it should be the culture of higher education, and we need to create less of a climate of blame and you know, the sense of catching cheaters, which I think sums it up perfectly. And there's my references, and again, I'll share the slides afterwards. So yeah, that's everything from me.
Thank you very much, Paul. Indeed, this was also very interesting. Allow me just to say a few words. Dr. Breen mentioned that his presentation is uncritical, which I don't quite agree with, because in a way, it shows us that in a more promising way, there is a potential to tame this new technology and use it to our advantage. And I really appreciate, Paul, for sharing your personal experiences. And this is exactly what I wanted to see as well, some real life applications, how ChatGPT can be used. And I think, at least for me, I have taken away a few ideas how, as a teacher, probably in future, you know, I could apply this for students' assessment. And finally, I think Dr. Britt's presentation pushes us to think that there are some things which you can do with ChatGPT, like doing mundane tasks or maybe proofreading. And there are some things which you cannot do, like evaluating critically the world or writing essays for that matter. So thank you very much, we'll appreciate it. Dr. Chatterjee, you do have a question, I believe.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it is again like Felix's. It's a very comprehensive and a brilliant presentation. I mean, it makes my task much easier, frankly speaking. Okay, I mean, because most of the points, in fact, have been have been covered. But there's a nice contrast also between the two presentations, I suppose. Okay, I mean, because Felix actually do sort of indicate at some of the positives, but it does it in a more, I think, serious way, and not the very casual, lazy way in which people, in fact, would sometimes fall into this idea that some changes, like most of the technological changes, in fact, are inevitable in life. So we have to sort of, swim along. So I think, this paper also has a lot of food for thought. Okay, I mean, and sort of also very nicely sort of contextually positioned. And I think it's also enriching by virtue of the fact that he had these very interesting, figments from his tours in China, where he sort of showcases some, snippets, which in fact is very different from the place where he teaches. Okay, I mean, so I learned a lot. Okay, I mean, I must confess that I'm the odd man out here, in the sense that I'm not an artificial intelligence guy. I'm not a person who's into machine learning, or even into something that Paul, in fact, has done, which is marry humanities and technology. Okay, I mean, so I have a certain kind of trepidation in terms of coming at the end, but nonetheless, I really like the paper. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there are other just as well, Alexander. I mean, I didn't talk at length about that, but we have also in UCL, we've done various other things with the tech, other than just, design assessments, for example. And we haven't done very much of that actually in UCL compared to other places. I think what we've tended to do is to use it as a sort of a prompt, maybe. Like I know in teacher education, for example, some students have been asked to create lesson plans through ChatGPT, and things like that, but not in a way Not in the sense that the answer is the definitive one or the finished one. And I think it's more, okay, so this is what it has produced, and these are the limits. And how would you tidy things up, maybe?
Definitely. I, by the way, totally agree. There is nice complementarity between the two presentations. There is also a very interesting question in the chat, but I would like to keep it until the very end, because I'm sure all of the panelists will have something to say. So on this note, let me turn finally to Dr. Shubhashish Chatterjee from Jadarpur University. Shubhashish, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to everybody. I do not have any slides to show. Okay, I mean, so I would just simply talk along a number of issues, which in fact are issues of great concern. But let me say at the outset, sort of and flag certain I think a priori conditionalities. Okay, I mean, which would be very significant in terms of my presentation. One is that, look, first is that I did pay a fair bit of attention on the ChatGPT in the last 1 month or so, because of the fact that I knew that I would have to speak. And when I read, the literature which in fact exists, which I could access on the ChatGPT, I'm really bewildered struck by the variety, okay, of the literature that exists. Okay, I mean, and you can therefore access it in terms of very different vantage points. Okay, and it also partly depends on what kind of physiognomy you have, what kind of normative commitments you hold, and also, I guess, your position. Okay, I mean, from which country you come from, what is the system that you are into. And the second thing, in fact, which builds on this is the fact that, look, I would very largely talk from the Indian sort of, what you call scenario and the Indian perspective. But, just to sort of peddle something which is a cliche, but like all cliches, they also hold a certain bit of truth, which is that India is such a diverse system that it's very difficult to generalize the Indian scenario. Okay, I mean, and so therefore, if I say that I'm presenting you an Indian standpoint, so please kindly don't get me wrong. I mean, there is no one Indian standpoint. Okay, I mean, and the situations, in fact, are very, very diverse. And if you sort of looked at that question that Divyani, in fact, had put into the chat box. Okay, I mean, so I think that in a sense, in fact, is this starting point, let's say, of my presentation, which is the fact that you have in India, for example, an educational setup, which in fact is so very divergent in nature, and we are passing through such trying and challenging times that it really, I think, becomes essential to link up many of these issues. Okay, I mean, I know that today's panel, in fact, is on the ChatGPT. Okay, I mean, and so therefore, I'm aware of the fact that much of the discussion should really revolve around the impact of the ChatGPT. But I'm drawn by the fact, which my two previous speakers, in fact, have also alluded to, that you cannot, discuss educational technology out of context. And so therefore, it is the situatedness of educational technologies that, in fact, is the most important point. And as a student of society at large, I'm an international relations person, but I see myself as a student of society. So as a student of society at large, I think it is the social setup, which in fact, to my mind, is the most important variable in this whole game. Now, my first point, in fact, is this, that look, if you look at the ChatGPT and its impact, one thing I guess has to be very clear, which is that it is not a kind of technology which we have encountered in the past. So there is a shift here. Okay, I mean, and it's a shift which I think needs to be underlined and needs to be, I think, given the due attention. Okay, I mean, and the shift, in fact, is this, that in a sense, the ChatGPT, in fact, is not something like, for example, a calculator. Okay, I mean, when the calculator first came, there were these kind of questions which in fact came up, which is that what the calculator is, in fact, is going to do to our computational ability and computational skills. But it became very clear within a relatively brief, short period of time that what the calculator, in fact, was doing was that it was eliminating the mechanized rote part of mathematical thinking. And as a result, in a sense, providing a sort of a scope for a more transcendental and more creative mathematical thinking, in fact, to come about. Now, I do not think that parallel, in fact, is going to hold, okay, when it comes to ChatGPT, okay, or something like the large, language models, which are very, very invasive, and where that distinction between what is mechanized and what is thoughtful is increasingly getting blurred. Okay, I mean, and therefore, that is the first, I think, point of concern, which is that there is something built into this technology. And because we have only seen the first generation, let's say, of these technologies, and more developments, in fact, would definitely going to, would be coming. And so therefore, one would have to, see the jury is definitely not out on this. And therefore, we have to be, I think, we have to concede the fact that unlike many other significant, I would say, technological developments that, in fact, have taken place in the past, ChatGPT and the challenge that the ChatGPT, in fact, possesses, in fact, is quite different. And I'm going to therefore share with you, something which I found, okay, I mean, which is, to my mind, it's troubling, okay, and I thought that this is worth sharing with you. This is an interview, okay, I mean, this is an interview taken by Andrew Gibson. It was taken in 2023, in January 2023. And what Gibson did, in fact, was that he puts questions to the, ChatGPT bot, and he gets answers to his questions. Okay, I mean, but these questions are distinctive. And the answers, if you ask me, I think they definitely demand a bit of our time. Okay, and so therefore, because I don't have the slides, so therefore, I would, draw on your patience, and I would just read out a few of these questions and answers, okay? And let me also tell you that I followed suit, okay? I typed in the same questions. I found somebody who has a, this ChatGPT account. So I typed in those questions myself in order to sort of validate and verify whether the answers, in fact, were coming right or not. And lo and behold, the answers, in fact, were exactly the same. Okay, I mean, so therefore, there is no mischief here. Okay, I mean, and so therefore, there is no need to think that there is something which, in fact, is odd here. So let me sort of read. I'm just going to read, 2 interview questions and 2 answers. Okay, I mean, and I'm going to read them a little bit slowly so that we are all on one page with regard to what is coming here. So the interviewer is asking, this is the first question. Wittgenstein famously argued that the meaning of words is due to their use within an overarching language game. Given that you are competent at the use of words within a given language game, would Wittgenstein consider you to be endowing words with meaning? Okay, I mean, so I found this is a fascinating question to type in. And this is the answer that ChatGPT, in fact, is giving. Wittgenstein's idea of language games states that the meaning of words is not determined by any inherent properties of the words themselves, but rather by the way they are used within a particular social context or language game. From this perspective, Wittgenstein would argue that meaning arises from the use of words in a specific context, and that the same word can have different meanings in different language games. Given that I am a machine learning model that has been trained on a large corpus of text, I can use words in a way that is similar to a human language and use the words in various contexts. It could be said that I'm able to understand and use words in a way that is similar to the way humans do. However, Wittgenstein would likely argue that I do not truly understand the meaning of words in the same way that humans do, as my understanding is based on patterns and associations learned from the data I was trained on, rather than on any of my own experience and understanding of the world. So, I mean, I possibly, there's no need to go further into this, okay? I mean, but this, to my mind, is frightening, frankly speaking, okay? I mean, this paragraph, if this is written by machine intelligence, I think there is something serious, okay? I mean, there is something that we really, really need to think about. And my concern is not the problem of cheating, okay? I mean, the reason for that is that, look, this whole idea of ingenuousness, of cheating, in fact, is a very vicious cycle. And I think both Paul and Felix, in their own ways, obviously in very different ways, I think have sort of alluded to it. I would agree more with what Paul, in fact, was broadly sort of arguing, which is that, I mean, the problem of cheating, in fact, has got accentuated by the fact that, the surveillance model, which in fact is put in. Now, that in fact had created ways and means to escape surveillance. Okay, I mean, and there is a certain kind of popular wisdom which says that, look, I mean, students who in fact would ultimately take to unfair means would take to unfair means. Okay, I mean, so no matter what kind of technological platform is available or not available to them, they would take to unfair means. Okay, and I was just sort of going through some of the random sampling of a number of philosophers, in fact, who have responded to this problem of the artificial intelligence, large language games, and pedagogy. And their responses, in fact, are also extremely significant. And this is the second part of which I'm drawing your attention to, which is that, look, in terms of philosophy, philosophers are divided by the middle, absolutely divided by. I mean, it shouldn't surprise us, social scientists in general, but in any, I think, field of knowledge, people, in fact, would be divided by the middle on most of the things. But I found that philosophers are divided by the middle in terms of many things. First is that, look, the way in which, a cognitive philosopher, and cognitive philosophy is a very significant, development in the philosophy of the mind as a subdiscipline. So the way in which a cognitive philosopher, in fact, who is sort of trained partly also in assessing the aspect of neuroscience, let's say, into the making of the artificial intelligence model and the way in which these are operationalized, the way in which these people, in fact, they respond, these philosophers respond, is very different from the way in which the linguistic philosophers, in fact, they look into the problem. So let me sort of very broadly, in a way, sort of, summarize what exactly the issues are about. So one position is very clear, which is this, that the problem with the artificial intelligence philosophically, in fact, is not merely the fact that they are imitating. And they're imitating in terms of a continuous sequence, let's say, of words, which they could predict because of their association with some kind of an algorithm on which they are trained. But the problem, in fact, is that they invariably create very big questions on basic fundamental human abilities, like, for example, autonomy, like, for example, agency, like, for example, sensibility, okay, or, what could be called very largely, sentient. So in other words, if you let's break this down one by one, okay, I mean, so if one sort of looks closely to autonomy, now autonomy, as we know, is an absolutely critical value, let's say, of humanity. Now, the idea of autonomy, why autonomy, in fact, becomes critically important to us, we know, is because of the fact that being autonomous is being able to be guided by reason. I mean, that is the idea of autonomy that Kant, in fact, ultimately provided us. And being truly autonomous, therefore, is our ability to follow the categorical imperative, by which we broadly sort of mean that we can't be autonomous if we are guided only by our desire. Because desire is particular, and only one thing which is universalizable, in fact, is reason. And that is a capacity which all human beings, in fact, would possess. So therefore, it is the universalization of a norm which all of us possess, at least theoretically. And therefore, it is also an immanent, potential, because reason is something which would have to be actualized, which ultimately is the essence of autonomy. Mill broadly sort of agreed with Kant, but then slightly disagreed and told us that desires could also be a basis for autonomy. So it is not necessarily that, we are autonomous when we are guided by reason, but we could also be autonomous when we are guided by desire. I mean, it sort of took more than 50 years, let's say, for an American philosopher, okay, I mean, Frankfurt, in fact, to very broadly drive home the point that when we are talking about autonomy, the critical point about autonomy, in fact, is the connection between our thought and action. Okay, I mean, so it's not merely the processing of the mind, but it is also the processing of the mind as exemplified through, action, which in fact is veritable, which in fact is discernible, that would constitute our capacity of being truly autonomous. I mean, if I strip aside the philosophical, aspect to it, the genuine idea, in fact, is this, that knowledge is supposed to be, in a sense, a kind of conduit to autonomy. Okay, in other words, that knowledge, in fact, is something that makes us autonomous. So if knowledge is now dehumanized to the extent that the artificial intelligence, in fact, would very broadly sort of create, what human knowledge, in fact, has traditionally created, in what sense would that knowledge qualify as being autonomous? Are we being autonomous then? So what exactly would this mean? What exactly would be the meaning of autonomy in this transformed context where machine learning, in fact, is not only imitating, but it is also, in a sense, maybe sort of thinking the way that human mind, in fact, is thinking. So in a sense, is the capacity of sentience, in fact, in a way being taken over ultimately by the artificial intelligence? And if that happens, I think it is definitely a cause for great, great concern. Okay, I mean, I'll just again sort of share with you the very basic of the sentience debate. I'm sure all of us, we know this, but nonetheless, all these issues, in fact, are in some sense contextual issues, and therefore they're relevant. At least I find them to be, I find to be, relevant. So the argument, therefore, is this, that look, I mean, if we broadly sort of say that what is the beginning of life? Is the beginning of life the point of birth, or is the beginning of life the point of conception? Put this question to ChatGPT and find out an answer. What exactly the ChatGPT, in fact, would say. I mean, there is no way in which the broad philosophical questions that humanity, in fact, have grappled with, this is my argument, to which definitive answers, in fact, were possible. And so therefore, in a sense, to make the argument that the ChatGPT, in fact, would be able to aid us, they cannot aid us in terms of giving definitive answers to questions which, in fact, are open-ended questions. And I think we have to appreciate the fact that much of human learning must remain open-ended. The moment you sort of bring in definitional closures, the moment you bring in rules and regulations, the moment you create more and more, what you call norm setters, it, in a sense, sort of in a way, I think it creates not only problems in terms of our own creativity, but it would also encourage machine learning, in fact, to emulate us better. Okay, I mean, so in other words, knowledge has to be, in some sense, understood as our capacity to break barriers. Okay, in order to be something that we do not sort of recognize. And that sort of takes you to the Socratic idea of knowledge. Okay, and that Socratic idea of knowledge, in fact, was very broadly an idea where Socrates very broadly sort of says very openly that I know that I do not know. And therefore, it is my quest of knowing what I do not know, which ultimately, in fact, would lead me to the, to know something which my cognition, in fact, is not aware of. I think, in a sense, pedagogy has remained, beholden to that original Socratic moment, which is that teachers, what do they do in class? What are we supposed to do in class? We are supposed to ask questions. We are supposed to provide puzzles, and we are supposed to, in a sense, be patient so that the new learners, who in fact are not hardwired in any way, give us answers and surprise us. I think one of the problems, and this is why the artificial intelligence models, in fact, are gaining popularity and gaining ground, is because of the fact that teachers have also become so mechanical. And teachers have also become, in a sense, I think, so sort of, routinized, that there is little joy that is left into the system. And if there is so little joy left into the system, and if somebody says that, well, a machine, in fact, would be able to do a better job, it's not really going to be very, I think, easy to say that ultimately the only defense we have left with, in fact, is the call to criticality. Criticality is absolutely essential. There's no doubt about it. But the defense of criticality, in fact, would ultimately have to come, provided we join criticality with that larger enterprise, which is, unalloyed joy of free thinking and creativity. And that free thinking and creativity is something which, unfortunately, is getting lost in the pedagogical system. And the last section of what I'm going to do, in fact, is that let's look at India, okay, I mean, as a microcosm of all this. Now, I teach at a public university, and frankly speaking, till now, I haven't really come across any ChatGPT, what you call situation in my setting. One thing could obviously have happened is that somebody might have used ChatGPT, but there's just no way of detecting whether that, ChatGPT was used or not. Okay. I mean, so it's a detection failure, let's say, at our end. But the larger question, in fact, is this, that how do you sort of, in a sense, assess pedagogy and academic systems? And unless and until we have some consensus with regard to this, what you call question, I think it really, I think it would really not really be taking us anywhere in terms of either critiquing the ChatGPT or the, algorithmic models, which in fact would be coming. And I hope all of us, we also know that many of these artificial, intelligence companies, they're working on aggregator platforms. Okay. I mean, so what would happen is a number of platforms like the ChatGPT, in fact, would come about, and there would be aggregator platforms where there would be finer, what you call, models, more developed models, which in fact is going to improve the quality of the aggregated, outcome. So in a sense, the line of technology, the line of technological development, in fact, seems to be, irreversible. I mean, it's just that it is just no way in which you could stop it. But the challenge, in fact, is ultimately in the pedagogical domain. Okay. And as I was telling you, if you look at India, private universities of the top league, like the Ashoka University, for example, or the Shiv Nadar or the Ajim Premji, okay, so they live a life of their own. So they're in a kind of a life world. Okay. I mean, their, constituency, their challenges, they're of one kind. If you look at the public education, scenario in India as a whole right now, I mean, it is enormous. At one level, there is a transition, which is the most significant structural transition that the system, in fact, has ever underwent, which is that the entire country is moving from a 3-year honors system to a 4-year honors system. We had a 3-year honors and a 2-year master system all through, and suddenly the entire country, in fact, is moving to a 4-year plus 1-year, master's program. And people just doesn't know that how this transition, in fact, is really able to happen. So there will always be registers to read education. Okay, I mean, your economic register is one where you read about what kind of budgetary allocations were available, what kind of fee structures were available, what kind of financial constraints, in fact, actually, in a sense, create pressure, let's say, on young minds, which in fact would produce this frightening statistics of suicides and mental health. There would also be the political registers at what education looks like when the identity, tracks, in fact, have become so fractured in most societies. So what is it that the educational setup, in fact, is really doing about it? Are we mirroring the political, what you call contestations? Or are we, in a sense, creating some kind of bastion of resistance, as education, in fact, has done in the past? Okay, I mean, are we democratizing, or we are in, sort of into some kind of a backsliding? And then there is also this technological register in which education, in fact, would have to be done. I mean, the real challenge for me, in fact, is this, that look, there have been enormous developments, as we know, on technology. There's no doubt about it. But all forms of technology, in some sense, have been human-centric. Okay, I mean, so there's been some kind of that human figure. The teacher, in fact, was always there in the class. Now you are suddenly confronted with this situation where there is no mediation between the student on the one hand and the teacher on the other. Okay, I mean, so there is this either a screen or there is some kind of an electronic mediation. And one simply, therefore, doesn't know what kind of dehumanization and what kind of possible consequences, in fact, would ultimately come about it. So I'll end there. Okay, I mean, and I would be very happy to, get your comments and questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chatterjee. Let me just probably give a few quick comments. This was really illuminating, lucid, and clear. And again, I do believe this complemented the rest of the presentations by highlighting the philosophical foundations of pedagogy, especially the idea of humanness and values like autonomy and transcendence of knowledge, the idea that knowledge must break boundaries, that we need to teach students to be creative, and so on and so forth. I think this is very important, and which is, and I would tend to agree, becomes less and less emphasized in current pedagogical practices. So ChatGPT probably cannot replace humans in cultivating these values. So these were really excellent points. Thank you very much, Shibashish. And let me ask, finally, open the floor to everybody else and see if anybody has any questions, any comments, any feedback. And by the way, let me also read out the question posted earlier by Devyani. I do believe Dr. Chatterjee addressed this, at least partially. Can technology be seen as a democratizing tool to the educational field in developing countries like India, where there is a lot of diversity in terms of access to learning resources? I wonder, Paul, if you would have any opinion on this?
I,
Oh, yeah, but please go ahead. Yeah.
Paul, please go ahead. I'll come after you. Yeah.
And, well, I suppose, and I'm speaking about this, having mentioned Mark Warsaw earlier, and a lot of the work that was being done when I did my master's degree almost 20 years ago. I think one of the dangers or one of the pitfalls is it takes time and experience and age to see this, unfortunately. You don't always see it at the start. We seem to keep having the same discussions every 20 years about this question of bridging the divide. And nothing has yet radically changed. So it would have been interesting to hear Felix's perspective on this, because it comes back to that whole thing about societal transformation and political transformation. Sometimes it feels like, again, in a slightly different way, and it's always, if you focus on individual identities or you focus on individual tools, you're not really going to have that kind of holistic transformation. So I don't think this is going to democratize the world or education, because for a start, it seems to largely be the main language of these models is English, though as far as I know, people in China are using equivalents of this. And I don't know, again, it's very difficult to know when they say they're using it. I didn't ask them if they're using it in English or Chinese, but I just presumed that they were using it in Chinese to do different things. So yeah, if it was available in a range of languages and those languages were given equal value, and again, all those languages were given equal status within universities, and universities were multilingual spaces, and we really did have kind of a world in which all states were equal, which is what we may have in the future, where there isn't this division between global north and global south, between what we call the West and the rest of the world. Then maybe if the climate of education and society and politics and economics obviously changed, then things like intelligent AI could be used to make a better world. But again, I see very few of these things being produced for the sake of getting a better world. generally the end motive becomes profit or something else, unfortunately. So that sounds very negative, but I haven't had breakfast yet, so that maybe accounts for it. But I mean, I'd be very, very interested to hear from someone in the Indian context, because I think that's I'm thinking about that very much from the perspective of looking at things as an Irish person, rather than as a British person. So I identify as Irish, and therefore having a more decolonial or decolonized perspective on the world, or wanting to see more of a decolonized world.
Well, Alessandro, can
Okay.
I add
Yeah.
a little bit? Yeah.
Of course, definitely.
So, I mean, my point would be that there are two ways in which the idea of the democratization could be understood here. One is that if you are understanding it in the sense of access to data, now their digital technology obviously is democratizing, there is no doubt about it. But there, the question in fact would be that, is the access free or is the access priced? Okay, I mean, so if you have the access is priced, then obviously it would mean that those who are able to pay the price would have the benefit of the access, and those who would not have the price would not have the benefit of the access. Okay, I mean, so if you were just concentrating in the higher educational institutions, most of the higher educational institutions in India would not be in a position to provide Wi-Fi connection, let's say, to the students when they're on campus. And if you look at the students, the kind of educational background, academic background, I'm sorry, the economic background that they come from, so they would have some kind of what you call mobile data, okay, I mean, in the devices that they're using. But the mobile data, in fact, would not be well strong enough, let's say, to provide uninterrupted access, okay, of the kind which in fact would really lead to some kind of meaningful empowerment if you look at it. Okay, I mean, so therefore, data democratization, I think, in the minimalist sense, has one particular sort of meaning. The second meaning, in fact, is this: that look, if you look closely, then what this data mining, in fact, has created, in fact, is it's really created two classes. Okay, I mean, one who, in fact, are consumers of the data. They do not understand how the process, in fact, is getting done. Okay, I mean, and those who understand the process, that's basically people who know how to write these algorithms. Okay, I mean, that's a very small elite. That and well, accordingly, how is it that their inputs, in fact, would be entirely neutral? Okay, I mean, Herbert Marcuse in One Dimensional Man. Okay, I mean, that's a text which obviously goes at a time which is pre-digital, but nonetheless, he made this absolutely stupendous argument that technology is never neutral. Okay, I mean, so technology would always have a social side to it, and it would always be in some kind of a combustible relationship with the mode of production. Okay, I mean, so therefore, if one looks closely, and you don't have to be a Marxist, by the way. Okay, I mean, the moment we use the word or the term mode of production, we might tend to think that, okay, the guy, in fact, is thinking along Marxian lines. No, but it's just that there is a political economy to every technology. Okay, I mean, and therefore, whether ultimately it sort of empowers people or people's preferences, in fact, they are corralled by the various digital bodies, and they're repackaged as commodified sort of benefits. That sort of depends on where you are and what kind of benefits and what kind of facilities you use. So I would therefore very broadly sort of say that in agreement with what Paul, in fact, by the way, in fact, has said on this, including his last point on the decolonization argument, that there is no easy answer to the question of whether this digital technologies in fact would be in a sense democratizing or not. And ChatGPT, I just want to emphasize this, has to be understood at least at the more agential level. Okay, I mean, it's you would be using the tool, and to what use you put to to a large extent, in fact, would depend on what kind of questions and what kind of benefits you were seeking. Can you get into the ChatGPT? I mean, can anyone get into the ChatGPT at this point of time? These are, I think, significant questions. I can tell you that in India, we are not in a position where, well, other than high-end students, who in fact are either in high-end schools or in universities and colleges where they have excellent facilities, are in a position, in fact, to get the benefits of these kind of platforms.
Thank you very much, Shivashish and Paul. And a few more comments from chat. Devyani thanks both of you and for raising these concerns about democratizing. And she expresses the worry that public universities in India are left behind. Our colleague, Professor Rajdeep Pakanti, also listed two interesting observations. First, ChatGPT may be regarded as a fact-fitting tool, according to some. And secondly, using his personal experience, very interesting, he has used ChatGPT to produce multiple choice questions. And it was useful for the false options, which I believe resonates nicely with Paul's presentations, that there are certain tasks which can be delegated to ChatGPT and which can free our time for something else. All right. And a few other interesting examples colleagues can later acquaint themselves with on what ChatGPT does with response to several philosophical or political questions. So let me ask if there are any final comments or feedback or questions to both the presenters from anyone. Okay, a question from Professor Vahid Jyotish. In the spirit of seeing ChatGPT as an agential tool, which we can use, can the speakers give more suggestions? I suppose suggestions how to integrate, right, in our syllabi, in our teaching practices, and so on.
I would say just the examples that I already gave, where it's used as a kind of modeler for the students. I mean, I've played around with it in terms of creative writing as well, and this is another point that links in well to what we've been saying. So I do some fiction writing as well, apart from academic stuff. And I was just playing around with it, and I asked it to generate some titles and some synopses, and even I put in some of my work and said, can you make this better? And it can come up with quite good responses, actually, especially as regards titles. So I would say, again, if for example, you had a literature class and you were teaching students how to do creative writing, you can use it in a positive way, in that it can help them to generate things that they can then critique, and they can also see their own weaknesses. So it can correct your writing. That doesn't mean that students should be encouraged to use it in a way that it writes for them. That's not how it should be used. So if, for example, someone is a creative writer, and their work is too repetitive, strangely, ChatGPT, which has a habit of repeating things in its bullshit generator form, it can pick that up quite quickly. So maybe there's more of the teacher in it than what we give it credit for, because it does seem able to spot weaknesses in text. But I think it's got to be used in a developmental way. And for that to happen, the culture has to change, because I imagine that many people are afraid to use it as a writing tool for their students because they're afraid that their students will just ask it to write an essay. And again, I don't know what the situation's like in India, but in the UK, certainly not where I am now, we don't have this in UCL, but in a previous institution, we used to have a workload allocation model. And I think you were given something like 40 minutes per student for marking their assignments. Now, if you're marking 2 student assignments, so each student might have two assignments per year. So if you've got 40 minutes allocated to mark that student's work, you're not going to have time to go through an essay and work out if a computer program has produced that, if Turnitin can't detect it. So that's why, again, what Felix was saying about catching the cheater, all these things are interconnected. Turnitin is a product of a neoliberal education system that's just about churning out essays and, very quick turnaround and marking. And until that changes, it probably is quite risky to use Turnitin as a modeling tool, to use ChatGPT as a modeling tool, because, it could encourage wrongful use of it. Yeah, so I think that's kind of what I would say about it.
Would you like to add anything, Shubhashish, onto that?
I like the 2 problems. One is that I don't have the experience of making direct use of it, so I would not really know in what ways the facility in fact would be used and misused. Okay, so one could have a theoretical understanding of how these things in fact work, but if you've not worked it, then you don't really have any experience on the basis of which you could say. But I could only broadly sort of say this, that look, we live in a world where the value of knowledge almost exclusively resides in the computational ability of raw data. Okay, so if that is how you understand knowledge, then anything which ultimately would fit into the raw data and therefore would be able to generate a pattern, and that pattern is useful in the way in which you assess, I think would therefore be useful for any kind of device that you ultimately create. And because raw data is abstract, the far removed we would be from the experiential. Okay, so therefore ChatGPT could ultimately be, or artificial systems, not ChatGPT, absolutely a death blow, let's say, to phenomenology. Okay, as a school of thought, let's say in philosophy, because very broadly, you don't put any value, let's say, on something which is lived experience. Okay, which ultimately has to be celebrated and brought back. I have no idea how we can sort of bring it back, because what is happening, in fact, is just the reverse, which is it's the enormous routinization and enormous formalization. And computation, in fact, will feed into formalization. Okay? So the more you are able to compute, the more you're able to put numbers to everything, the more, even language, in fact, how is it that these machines, in fact, are producing the language? Okay, to say that, okay, it's an example of a large language model is not enough. Okay, so one would also have to understand, at least at the basic, that how the number game, in fact, ultimately also produces the logic of, let's say, words. Okay, and so therefore, if you look at the kind of technologies that, in fact, are waiting in the wings, and if you talk to people, in fact, who work on these technologies, I'm benefited by the fact that I'm on a campus which has a very, very good engineering universe faculty, and I do tend to have these conversations with my engineering friends, and so it, in a sense, it can create a kind of an sort of a, I would say, unbridgeable gap okay, I mean, between the way in which the world of humanities and the world of sciences will ultimately sort of, travel. I hope it doesn't. Okay, I mean, I still believe that the human potential, in fact, is more stronger and more ingenuous than anything that our ingenuity, in fact, would create. But I don't know. I mean, what I sometimes hear from my engineering friends, in fact, is something which is scary. Okay, I mean, look at the quantum computational models, for example, which are getting ready. Okay, I mean, all our computer systems, in fact, are 0-1 binary systems, as we know. Okay, I mean, so you can have 0-0, 1-0, 0-1, 1-1. Okay, I mean, so all your combinations, in fact, would be playing around this. If you have the quantum, the jump, in fact, is so huge and so just unimaginable that how much processing of data and how quickly it could be done by those supercomputers, and where would all this thing ultimately end. Anyway, okay, I mean, but there is no concrete sort of answer as to beyond what Paul, in fact, has said, that obviously some of this could be used at some level, provided that the instructor and the student, they understand what they're doing. Okay, I mean, so I think a training of both, therefore, is needed. If you are using something like the ChatGPT in class, then the instructor also has to know that what exactly it is, what are its limitations. So if the understanding works on both sides, I think it can be used. Okay, I mean, and my fear is that it will be used more and more. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Perhaps any last concluding thoughts or question from anyone? All right.
I suppose, will there be, will the recording be uploaded to YouTube or anything?
It should be. I'll double check with the IT. Usually we have recordings uploaded to YouTube. Yes.
Okay.
And I will definitely share this. And also there was a request from colleagues to share PPTs if possible, if that's comfortable.
Yeah.
We can arrange this later.
Yeah, I sent you a copy of mine yesterday.
Yes, I have it. Thank you very much, Paul. Well, on this note, let me conclude and let me thank both the presenters and Felix, even though he's absent, for taking your time and for joining us and for sharing your perspectives. I'm extremely happy that we actually managed to provide several different perspectives on ChatGPT and pedagogy. And I'm quite sure that this will leave a lot of food for thought for JSIA, for our department. Personally, I have learned immensely, and I hope this will be also beneficial for the rest. So let me thank you on behalf of Junior School of International Affairs. Thank you very much for your expertise, for your time, and wishing you a great day ahead.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, bye. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good day.